German Americans from Fort Wayne participate militarily, the same as people of other ethnic backgrounds. I've counted out the numbers on this. There are as many people of German American background in the United States Army from Allen County as would be represented by their total overall numbers. The first American from Allen County to be killed in combat was a man by the name of, I believe, Karl Winkelmeyer, a clear German-American lad from Fort Wayne. So German-Americans certainly carry their share of the load, and some more in World War I. The war doesn't really last all that long in terms of the United States, and it's probably a good thing because there was more tension as American casualties, especially in 1918, began to take on very serious dimensions. Something like 129 people from Allen County died in the war, and a heavy share of them, not all, but a heavy share of them were of German background. So Germans were paying their price for World War I. All of a sudden, being a German was now something that you tried to disguise or hide, and it was impossible to hide or disguise your German accent and your religious affiliations and the like, the spelling of your name, and it created real identity crises, and it created much internal pain and hurt for Germans to now see their families, their relatives in Europe being represented as Huns with no civilization, no culture, and as some kind of brutal barbarians. So it was a terribly traumatic event. But you didn't wear your German ethnicity on your sleeve any longer, and in fact, you tried, if at all possible, to minimize that. Some people played with the spelling of their last name. I haven't been able to find anyone who completely changed their name, but some would drop a second N on the final consonant of their name, for example, to give it a slightly more English look to it. And people were more careful to name the first names of their children, names that were clearly either Anglo or acceptable in Anglo eyes. So the German sense of being German is much diminished after World War I. It's not gone, but it's much diminished.
Well, the war ends and we're not quite a German town anymore. Some of the churches, the old downtown churches, still have some German spoken in their classrooms and in their halls for their ceremonies. Some churches still have one or two German ceremonies or so a week, but at the same time, even the most German churches, you see English being spoken in the schools. You see English coming into the religious ceremony, and you see Germans slowly being weeded out. By the 20s, the German newspaper goes out of business because no one's reading it anymore.
Here there's no team in Fort Wayne that's the Fort Wayne Germans or anything of that kind. I mean, the kinds of totems that are selected are far more traditional than that. And while you have your Catholic and your Lutheran high schools, it's they are virtually assimilated into the broader American society by that point.
At the same time, the big push is on for prohibition, which is somewhat related to actually women's right to vote. The two kind of were tied together for a while. But prohibition happens, and here we have breweries throughout town, German breweries. Every brewery here is a German brewery. Trying to figure out what to do. Well, some of them start producing what we would call today near beer, basically no alcohol content, but it kind of tastes like beer, light beer if you will. Some of them start going into the medical industry and making nice, pure medical alcohol. How much of that ended up getting into the general populace instead of going to the hospitals is debatable at this point. But they try to survive, and a couple of them do survive. But at the same time, before the war, you had the parks where they were owned by the brewery that had these great German beer festivals and such. And that can't happen anymore. And the parks become either part of the park system of Fort Wayne or they're built on.
During World War II, German Americans here in Fort Wayne were major war leaders, war workers, and so on, and it does not have the sting that World War I had had. Most Americans did not have the kind of overblown idealism with which they'd gone into World War I. There was not the same degree of bitterness. The Liberty Gardens now become victory gardens. You're not going after liberty any longer. If you can just win, that's sufficient. And as a consequence, the ideological component of the war is not as strong. People do not get as carried away in World War II as they did in World War I. In 1944, the United States began moving German prisoners of war into the U.S. These were prisoners who had been captured a year and a half earlier in North Africa and were now coming in from the invasion in Italy. The Germans had been mounting most of the fighting in Italy. And there were just no space to keep those prisoners either on the European continent. Great Britain had German prisoners galore they could not handle anymore. So they were set up somewhere in the vicinity of about 500 different German prisoner of war camps in the United States. A relatively small one was established in Fort Wayne in 1944, housed anywhere from 600 to 1,300 German prisoners in a camp on the near southeast edge of Fort Wayne, near Wayne Trace and the railroads. The enlisted men, not officers, but the enlisted men were encouraged to work outside the camp, and at least 80% of them did. They either worked on farms, planting potatoes, harvesting potatoes. They worked at a big celery farm, Sweet's celery farm in the south edge of Fort Wayne. They worked for the city park system. They even worked for the city theater, doing cleaning up kinds of jobs, mostly unskilled labor. Some Fort Wayne folks grew unhappy when they heard that German prisoners could have 1 bottle of beer a day and 2 packs of cigarettes a week. It was the cigarettes that was particularly galling, because in Fort Wayne at that time you could buy cigarettes, but it was difficult. They were in very, very short supply, and you were having to buy what amounted to generic brands before anyone had ever heard of generic brands, and those were viewed as not very good cigarettes, and they probably weren't. And then you heard that the German prisoners could buy 2 packs per week with the money that they had earned. There was some unhappiness. But what the United States Army was trying to do, and most good folks in the hometowns never quite understood this, was to protect the interests of American prisoners of war in German war camps. And the United States held very, very scrupulously to the 1929 Geneva Convention that governed the treatment of prisoners of war. So apparently this was not a prison that was, that was what our usual images of prisoner of war camps were like. And most of the prisoners pretty much liked their experience. Some prisoners, after they had been repatriated to Germany, once they got a chance, came back to the United States. I've talked to at least one who moved back to Fort Wayne in the 1950s. So their experience was reasonably good. There were plenty of people in Fort Wayne who could still speak German, for example. Most of the farms that they worked on were of German-American farms. They went over to a combined canning factory and brewery, and I believe it's in Defiance, Ohio, and every time came back smashed, including the guards who went with them. So this was not any kind of brutal concentration camp by any means. The prisoners ate very well. The United States government ensured that they ate well, had plenty of recreation. Fort Wayne people would go out on Saturday afternoons to watch the German prisoners play soccer. There were soccer tournaments and so on. So they had a pretty good reception from the Fort Wayne folk, with the exception of the cigarettes.
Could be your cousins. So there were still the ties between Fort Wayne and Germany that meant that it was a bittersweet war effort. I mean, it was sad because a lot of the kids from Fort Wayne were going over there to the European theater and literally shooting at their cousins and relatives who were shooting back at them.